a dying woman, a war horse, and the man who hunted her for 12 years. Wade's gun aimed at her heart, one finger on the trigger. Then the old horse stepped forward, placing himself between the bullet and his rider. Even Wade whispered, "Even the horse is braver than me." This is the story of Eleanor Brooks, the angel of death, and the only friend who never judged her. If you love stories of loyalty that transcend death, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you were watching from. Now let's begin. Our story starts 6 months before that fateful morning, in a dusty Arizona town called Red Hollow, where a woman named Eleanor Brooks had been hiding for 5 years. The bullet struck metal 6 inches from her head. The sound rang out across the freight yard like a bell tolling for the dead. Eleanor Brooks felt the heat of it even through the blood loss, even through the numbness that had settled into her bones like disease settling into marrow. She pressed her back against the rusted freight car morning sun already heating the metal. Her left shoulder screamed where Wade's first shot had torn through muscle and sinew. Blood ran down her arm in hot ribbons dripping onto dust-covered ground and turning it dark red. The world had narrowed to this pain and the certain knowledge that death was circling her like wolves around wounded prey. Through the heat shimmer, she could hear them. 6 horses, 6 men. Wade Kellerman's voice cut through the wind like a knife through silk. 15 years I've waited for this, Brooks. Eleanor's hand trembled as she raised her revolver. Not from fear, never from fear. The tremor came from deeper places, from nerves that had begun their slow betrayal months ago, from a body that had finally decided it was tired of carrying the weight of old wars. She looked down at her wrist. The scar there was barely visible, now faded to a thin white line against weathered skin. But she could still feel it burning. Still smell the smoke from that night in 1874, when Wade Kellerman had set fire to the medical tent, when he had tried to kill her the first time, when everything that came after had been set in motion like dominoes arranged by the hand of fate itself. Another shot, closer this time. The freight car shuddered. Rust rained down like iron snow. Eleanor's finger found the trigger. 80 yards through the heat shimmer to the shadow she could barely see. The wind was gusting from the northwest at 15 knots. She'd made harder shots. Made them when she was younger, when her hands were steady, when her lungs didn't fill with blood every time she drew a deep breath. She sighted down the barrel. The world contracted to that small space between the gun's front sight and the man who wanted her dead. Her finger tightened. 1 pound of pressure. 2, 3. Then she coughed. Blood spattered the dust at her feet, bright red against pale wall earth. The gun wavered. Wade's voice again triumphant now. "You're dying anyway. Why not go down fighting?" Eleanor lowered the gun. A smile touched her lips, bitter as alkali water, hard as the desert around her. When she spoke, her voice carried across the freight yard with the weight of absolute truth. "Because I already died once, in 1874. The wind kicked up dust. Heat shimmered, and somewhere across the freight yard, Wade Kellerman stopped, moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing for just one moment as those words hit him like a physical blow. Then darkness took Eleanor Brooks, and she fell into memory like a stone into deep water. 6 months earlier, the desert heat of Arizona Territory summer hung over Red Hollow like a woolen blanket soaked in sweat and bad intentions. The town sat at the edge of nowhere, 200 souls clinging to existence, where civilization hadn't quite decided if it wanted to take root or blow away with the dust. Main Street ran straight as a rifle barrel from the Last Chance Saloon on the north end to the livery stable on the south, lined with false-fronted buildings that pretended to be more substantial than they were. It was the kind of place people came to forget or to be forgotten. Eleanor Brooks had chosen the latter. She sat in the back room of Martha Donovan's dress shop, needle moving through fabric with the mechanical precision of long practice. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, turning dust motes into lazy constellations. Her fingers worked without conscious thought, mending a tear in a cavalry uniform jacket. The wool was faded, the buttons tarnished. Some young man's treasure from a war he'd survived, now worn to church on Sundays, to remind himself and everyone else that he'd once been something more than a farmer fighting alkali soil. Eleanor understood that need, understood it better than anyone in Red Hollow suspected. She was 46 years old, but looked older. Time and hard living had carved lines into her face that had nothing to do with laughter. Her hair pulled back in a severe bun had gone silver at the temples and threaded with gray throughout. Her hands, when they weren't occupied with work, trembled slightly. A symptom Dr. Hayes had told her of nervous exhaustion. What he didn't know, what she'd never told him, was that the tremor came from deeper places. From the part of her that remembered holding a rifle so still that she could drop a man at 200 yards. From the part that couldn't reconcile that steadiness with the shaking that had crept into her bones like winter cold into old foundations. The bell above the shop door rang. Eleanor didn't look up, didn't need to. In 5 years of living in Red Hollow, she'd perfected the art of being invisible. People came, people went, and Eleanor Brooks remained in the back room sewing and silent, a ghost haunting the margins of other people's lives. "Mrs. Brooks," Martha's voice uncertain, "someone's asking after you." Eleanor's needle stopped mid-stitch. In 5 years, no one in Red Hollow had asked after her. She'd made certain of that. "Tell them I'm busy." "It's about your horse." The needle slipped, pricked her finger. Blood welled up, a single drop of red on the pad of her thumb. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, watching it grow, feeling the sting. Then she set the jacket aside and stood. Sterling. The livery stable squatted at the end of Main Street like a patient animal, waiting for its owner to remember it existed. The structure was old but solid, built by men who understood that some things needed to last. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and manure and horse sweat, familiar smells that took Eleanor back to places she'd rather not go. Sterling stood in the last stall, separate from the other horses. He was 18 years old, ancient for a horse, especially one who'd lived the life he'd lived. His coat had faded from black to the color of smoke, dappled with white, that spread across his shoulders like snow on dark ground. Scars marked his hide, old wounds that had healed but never quite disappeared. His left eye was clouded with the beginning of cataracts. He favored his right foreleg on cold mornings. But when Eleanor approached, he lifted his head with an alertness that belied his age. His ears pricked forward. A low sound rumbled in his chest, not quite a whinny, more like a greeting between old soldiers who'd seen too much to need words. Eleanor's fingers traced the familiar grooves in his mane, grounding herself in the present. "Hey, old friend," she whispered. Sterling's breath was warm against her palm. She'd bought him from the army in 1881, paying more than she could afford for a horse they deemed too old for service. That was 5 years ago now, in the summer before she'd settled in Red Hollow for good. They hadn't understood. How could they? They'd seen a worn-out cavalry mount. Eleanor had seen the only living thing that knew her secrets and had never judged her for them. She slipped a sugar cube from her pocket. Sterling's lips were soft as velvet, taking it from her hand. For a moment, there was peace. Then she heard the voice behind her. "That's a war horse." The words fell into the stable's quiet like stones into still water. Eleanor turned slowly, every instinct screaming danger even as her face remained carefully neutral. The man stood in the stable doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He was tall, lean in the way men get when they've spent years riding hard and eating less. When he stepped forward into the dimness, Eleanor saw a face marked by sun and wind and something harder. A scar ran down his right cheek, puckered and white. His right hand, when he removed his hat, was missing 2 fingers. She knew that hand, knew those missing fingers, knew the exact moment they'd been lost, could still hear the scream that had followed. But she kept her face blank, her voice level. 12 years of practice had taught her how to wear masks. "He's just old." The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, I spent 7 years in the cavalry. I know a war horse when I see one. The way he holds himself, the scars, the alertness." He stepped closer. Sterling's ears went back. "Where'd you get him?" "Bought him years ago from a farmer." The lies came easily. They always had. "What farmer sells a horse like this?" "One who needed money more than he needed a hopoam." The man studied her for a long moment. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, without revealing anything. She'd stared down worse than him. Much worse. Finally, he replaced his hat and nodded toward Sterling. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Everything in Eleanor screamed no, but saying no would draw attention, would make him curious, would make him dig. So she stepped aside, giving him access to the stall while her heart hammered against her ribs like a prisoner testing the bars of a cell. The man ran his hand down Sterling's shoulder, tracing one of the old scars. Sterling stood rigid, tolerating the touch, but not welcoming it. These are bullet wounds. Old ones. He looked back at Eleanor. Your farmer friend buy him from the army. I didn't ask. Funny thing about army horses. They're branded, and they're trained to specific commands. He paused. You ever notice him responding to things he shouldn't understand? Eleanor's mouth went dry. The man was fishing. Had to be. There was no way he could know. No way he could guess that every morning she whispered commands in German to Sterling, commands taught to her by a Prussian cavalry trainer during the war, commands that no American soldier would know unless they'd served under very specific officers in very specific units. He's just a horse, she said. The man smiled again. This time it looked almost sad. Ma'am, I don't know who you're hiding from. Don't much care, truth be told. But I know a liar when I hear one. And I know a war horse when I see one, which makes me wonder what kind of woman needs to hide the fact that she owns one. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked out into the brutal afternoon sun. Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded. Then she sank onto a hay bale, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Her hands shook worse than ever. She pressed them together, trying to still the tremor, trying to push back the tide of memory that threatened to drown her. Sterling nudged her shoulder. When she looked up, his dark eyes were watching her with what might have been concern. Horses didn't worry, but Sterling had always been different. Sterling had always known. It's all right, she told herself. He's just passing through. He'll be gone tomorrow. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Knew it in the marrow of her bones, in the place where old soldiers kept their instincts about danger. The man wasn't passing through. The man was hunting. That evening, Eleanor walked the long way home, taking the back streets where shadows gathered early and people were scarce. Her small house sat on the eastern edge of town, close enough to be respectable, but far enough that visitors were rare. It was exactly what she'd wanted when she'd bought it 5 years ago. A place to be alone with her ghosts. Inside, the rooms were sparse. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, a trunk against one wall that she hadn't opened in years. Everything a woman needed to survive, but nothing that suggested she actually lived here. It was a way station, not a home. She'd stopped having homes in 1874. Eleanor lit the oil lamp and set water to boil for coffee. Her hands moved through the familiar routine while her mind spiraled down darker paths. The man in the stable had recognized Sterling. Worse, he'd recognized what Sterling's presence meant. War horses didn't end up with seamstresses. Didn't end up hidden in small Arizona towns where nothing happened and nobody asked questions. She poured coffee into a tin cup and sat at the table staring at nothing. The evening heat pressed against the walls. Somewhere outside, children were laughing. Normal sounds. The sounds of lives that hadn't been shattered and reassembled into shapes that no longer quite fit. Her gaze drifted to the trunk. She hadn't opened it in 12 years. Had promised herself she never would. Inside were things that belonged to another woman. A younger woman. A woman who'd believed that skill with a rifle could change the world, that precision and duty mattered, that there was honor in being the best at killing from a distance. Lieutenant Eleanor Brooks, the angel of death. The woman who dropped 127 confirmed enemy combatants from ranges that shouldn't have been possible. The woman who'd saved her entire unit at Canyon Creek. The woman who'd trained a horse named Sterling to stand motionless while she fired from his back, to ignore the chaos of battle, to carry wounded men through hell while bullets sang past his ears. That woman was dead, had died in the smoke and screams of 1874. Eleanor had buried her deep and built something else on top. Something quieter, something that wouldn't wake screaming in the night. But the trunk remained, and now a stranger was asking questions. She drank her coffee. It was bitter and strong, the way she'd learned to drink it during the war, when sleep was a luxury and alertness was survival. Outside, the laughter faded. Night settled over Red Hollow like a blanket over a corpse. Eleanor stood and walked to the window. Main Street was empty now, the false-fronted buildings dark except for the saloon, which glowed with lamplight, and the sounds of men drinking away the heat. She scanned the street, looking for movement, for anything out of place. There, across from the saloon, a figure standing in shadow watching her house, too far to make out features. but the silhouette was familiar. Tall, lean, hat pulled low. The man from the stable. Eleanor stepped back from the window, her heart rate climbing. She'd been found before. 3 times in 12 years, she'd had to move to rebuild her careful invisibility. But those had been accidents, coincidences, men who'd recognized her face from old wanted posters or newspaper sketches from the war. This felt different. This felt deliberate. She crossed to the trunk, knelt beside it. Her fingers found the lock. The key hung on a string around her neck beneath her dress where it had rested against her skin for over a decade. She told herself it was just habit keeping it there. Told herself she'd thrown away with the key open. She'd lied to herself as thoroughly as she lied to everyone else. The lock clicked open. Eleanor lifted the lid slowly as if something inside might escape if she moved too fast. The smell hit her first: gun oil, leather, old smoke that had soaked into fabric and never quite dissipated. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw it all laid out like artifacts in a tomb. The uniform jacket, gray wool, faded to the color of old ash. The boots still caked with mud from battles she could name. The hat with the bullet hole through the crown. And beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth, the Springfield model, 1873. Her rifle. Eleanor's hands moved without conscious thought, unwrapping the oilcloth, revealing the weapon that had been extension of her will for 14 years of military service. The wood was still perfect. The metal still gleamed. She'd cleaned it obsessively before putting it away, unable to let it go to rust, even as she'd sworn never to fire it again. She lifted it. The weight was familiar, comfortable in a way that terrified her. Her hands stopped shaking when they held it. That was the worst part. The tremor that plagued her every other moment disappeared when she held an instrument of death. Her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. Beneath the rifle, other things. A medal she'd never worn. A photograph, edges curled with age. She lifted it carefully, afraid it might crumble at her touch. 12 faces stared back at her from across 13 years. Young men, most of them. Boys really playing at being soldiers before the war taught them what that actually meant. She recognized each one, could name them still, could describe how 10 of them had died. Corporal Wade Kellerman stood in the back row grinning at the camera. Both his hands were whole. His face was unmarked. He'd written on the bottom of the photograph in careful script, "To Lieutenant Brooks, you saved us all." Eleanor's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing the tears. Crying was for people who had the luxury of regret. She'd used up that luxury years ago. A sound from outside brought her back to the present. Hoofbeats, slow and measured. Not someone passing through. Someone circling. Someone watching. Eleanor set the photograph aside and stood still, holding the rifle. She moved to the window, staying in shadow, and looked out. 5 riders now, the man from the stable and 4 others. They'd spread out along the street's edge, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough to send a message. "We know where you live. We're watching. We're not leaving." Sterling. They were too close to the livery. If they hurt Sterling. Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle. Old instincts surged up, telling her where to stand, how to brace, what angle would give her the best shots. She could drop 3 of them before they knew where the bullets came from. The other 2 would scatter, and she could track them down in the dark, finish them at her leisure. The thoughts came unbidden, unwelcome, utterly natural. She forced herself to lower the rifle, forced her breathing to slow. This was why she'd put the gun away. This was why Lieutenant Brooks had to stay dead, because that woman solved problems with precision violence. That woman was very, very good at killing. And Eleanor had learned the hard way that being good at something terrible didn't make it any less terrible. The riders moved on, but the message had been delivered. Eleanor wrapped the rifle back in its oilcloth with shaking hands. The tremor had returned the moment she'd set the weapon down. She placed everything back in the trunk, closed the lid, locked it. But she kept the key around her neck, just in case. The night passed in fragments. Eleanor would doze, then wake to phantom sounds. Hoofbeats that weren't there, voices that existed only in memory, the smell of smoke from fires that had burned out 13 years ago. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely. She dressed in the dark, pulled on her boots, and slipped out the back door into the pre-dawn chill. The walk to the livery was short, but felt longer. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could be the prelude to violence. Eleanor had spent 12 years trying to forget how to think like a soldier, and in one day it had all come flooding back. Sterling was awake when she entered his stall. Horses didn't need much sleep. He greeted her with his usual quiet rumble, not disturbed by the hour. Eleanor ran her hands over him, checking for new injuries, any sign that someone had been here during the night. Nothing. He was fine. Safe. For now. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, breathing in the smell of him. Horse sweat and hay, and something uniquely Sterling, familiar as her own heartbeat. "They found us," she whispered. "I don't know how, don't know what they want, but they found us." Sterling's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice. He couldn't understand the words, but he knew her tones. Knew when she was afraid, even if she'd never admit it out loud. Eleanor straightened, digging in her pocket for another sugar cube. As Sterling took it, she found herself speaking in German, the words flowing without thought. "Halten. Hold." Sterling's entire body went rigid. In an instant, he transformed from an old horse taking sugar from his owner's hand to something else. Something that belonged on battlefields. His weight distributed perfectly across all four legs. His head came up to precise attention. His muscles locked into a stance that could absorb the recoil of a rifle fired from his back without shifting an inch. Eleanor's heart stopped. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to test if he still remembered. 12 years since she'd given that command, and Sterling responded as if it had been yesterday. "Easy," she said, switching back to English. "Easy, boy. We're not at war. We're not soldiers anymore." But Sterling held the position for another 3 seconds before slowly, incrementally relaxing back into the shape of an old horse. His eyes found hers. In them, Eleanor saw what she'd been trying to deny. Sterling hadn't forgotten, hadn't truly left the war behind any more than she had. They'd both just gotten very good at pretending. She left him with trembling hands and a heart full of dread. The sun was rising as she walked back through town, painting Red Hollow in shades of gold and shadow. Beautiful if you didn't look too close. If you ignored the way some of the buildings leaned, the way dust collected in corners, no one bothered to sweep the way people lived their small, desperate lives and called it enough. Eleanor was halfway home when she saw him. Marshal Wyatt Carson sat on her front porch, hat in his lap, looking for all the world like he'd been there for hours. He was 53 years old, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He'd been Marshal of Red Hollow for 8 years. Before that, he'd been a lieutenant colonel in the Army. They'd never spoken about it, never acknowledged that they'd both worn the same uniform, fought the same war. It was an unspoken agreement. The past stayed buried as long as both of them kept quiet. Apparently, that agreement had just ended. "Mrs. Brooks," he said as she approached, "mind if we talk?" Eleanor's first instinct was to say no, send him away, maintain the fiction that she was nothing more than what she appeared to be. But Carson's eyes held something she recognized. Not threat, warning. She unlocked the door and let him inside. They sat at her small table. Eleanor didn't offer coffee. This wasn't a social call. Carson placed his hat on the table between them. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "The man who was asking about your horse yesterday, his name is Wade Kellerman." Eleanor managed not to react, managed to keep her face blank even as the name hit her like a fist to the stomach. She'd known, of course she'd known, had recognized him the moment she'd seen those missing fingers. But hearing the name spoken aloud made it real in a way recognition hadn't. "I don't know him," she said. Carson sighed. "Eleanor, we've maintained our mutual fiction for 5 years. I think it's time we stopped." The use of her first name was deliberate, a signal that they were speaking now not as marshal and citizen, but as soldiers who'd served. Eleanor said nothing, waited. Wade Kellerman served in the 7th Cavalry Medical Unit from 1871 to 1874. He was dishonorably discharged after being court-martialed for torture of prisoners. The officer who reported him was a Lieutenant Eleanor Brooks. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hands resting on the table began to shake. She pulled them into her lap, hiding the tremor. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Not for him. He's been looking for you for 12 years. Tracked down 2 other members of your old unit. Both are dead now, no charges filed. Witnesses too scared to talk." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. Names and faces flashed through her mind. Henderson, Michaels, good men. Men who'd served honorably. Men who'd survived the war only to be murdered by someone who should have been their brother. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Carson leaned forward. "Because Wade Kellerman didn't come to Red Hollow by accident. He came here for you, and he didn't come alone. I count 6 men riding with him. All of them wanted in other territories. All of them loyal to Wade because he pays well and doesn't ask questions. What does he want? I was hoping you could tell me that." Eleanor looked at her hands. The tremor was getting worse. In another hour, she wouldn't be able to hold a cup steady, let alone a gun. "I reported him for war crimes," she said. "He was torturing prisoners, not for information, for pleasure. I documented it, testified at his court-martial. He was discharged, lost everything, his rank, his pension, his honor. And now he wants revenge, apparently." Carson was quiet for a moment. Then, "You should leave, tonight. Take your horse and ride south. I'll tell him you ran east, give you a head start." Eleanor shook her head. "Running won't stop him. You said yourself he's been hunting me for 12 years. If I run, he'll follow. And the next town won't have a marshal who served, won't have anyone who understands. Staying gets you killed. Maybe, but at least it ends here. At least Red Hollow is the last place that has to bleed for my past." Carson studied her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and gently took her hands in his. The tremor was obvious now, impossible to hide. "This isn't just fear, is it?" he asked quietly. Eleanor pulled her hands back. "Nervous condition. The doctor says it's from stress." "The doctor is wrong." Carson's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen this before. In men who served too long, who saw too much. The body eventually rebels against what the mind made it do." Eleanor said nothing. What was there to say? He was right. Every doctor she'd seen had diagnosed stress, nervous exhaustion, any number of fashionable ailments. None of them had wanted to acknowledge the truth, that Eleanor Brooks' body was slowly, inevitably shutting down. The tremor was just the beginning. Soon there would be other symptoms. Worse symptoms. "How long?" Carson asked. 6 months, maybe 8. And Wade doesn't know. No one knows, except you. Now." Carson stood retrieving his hat. At the door he paused. "For what it's worth, Lieutenant, what you did during the wonder mattered. You saved lives. Good lives, that counts for something. Does it count more than the 127 I took?" Carson had no answer for that. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor sat alone in her small kitchen as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to build. Her hands shook in her lap. Somewhere outside, Wade Kellerman was planning his revenge. And somewhere deeper inside, the woman who'd been Lieutenant Eleanor Brooks stirred in her grave, testing the weight of the earth that held her down. The town meeting happened at noon when the heat was at its worst and tempers were already running short. Marshal Carson had called it posting notices on every building that mattered. Eleanor arrived late, slipping in through the back of the church where people had gathered because it was the only building large enough to hold half of Red Hollow's population. She stood against the rear wall, trying to make herself small, trying to be invisible the way she'd been invisible for 5 years. But the moment she entered, conversations died. Heads turned, eyes found her and held her with the weight of judgment and fear, and something that might have been hope if hope weren't such a dangerous thing. Carson stood at the front beside the pulpit that Reverend Thomas used on Sundays to preach about forgiveness and salvation. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. Forgiveness was for people who hadn't done what she'd done. Salvation was for souls that could still be saved. "Most of you know why we're here," Carson began. His voice carried in the sudden quiet, measured and calm. "Wade Kellerman and his men have been in Red Hollow for 3 days. In that time, they've made it clear they're not leaving. And they've made it clear who they're interested in." More eyes turned toward Eleanor. She kept her face blank, her hands clasped in front of her to hide the tremor. A man stood up near the front. Frank Morrison, who owned the Mercantile and fancied himself Red Hollow's voice of reason. "Then the solution is simple. We give them what they want." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eleanor had expected this, had known it was coming. People were practical in frontier towns. One woman's life against the peace of 200 souls wasn't a difficult calculation. "Frank," Carson said quietly, "sit down. Why should we die for her secrets? She brought this trouble. Let her face it. Frank, Carson's voice hardened just a fraction. I said, sit down. Morrison remained standing. We have a right to protect ourselves. If giving them Mrs. Brooks means they leave, then that's what we should do. Before Carson could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Sarah Dalton stood up from the middle pews, her hands clenched at her sides. She was 29, widowed 2 years prior when fever had taken her husband. She worked at the boarding house, kept to herself, raised her 2 boys alone. Eleanor had spoken maybe 10 words to her in all the years they'd lived in the same town. You want to hand over a woman who's done nothing wrong? Sarah's voice shook but held steady. Hand her over to men who've already killed 2 people. What kind of cowards are we? It's practical, Morrison shot back. It's evil, and if we do it, we're no better than they are. The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped, some supporting Morrison, others backing Sarah, most just afraid and looking for any solution that would make the fear go away. Eleanor watched it all with the detached clarity that comes from knowing your fate is being decided by people who don't understand what they're deciding. Carson let it go on for 30 seconds, then pulled his revolver and fired a single shot into the church ceiling. The silence was immediate and absolute. Here's what's going to happen, Carson said into that silence. Wade Kellerman is wanted for murder in 2 territories. That makes him my problem, not yours. He wants Mrs. Brooks. He goes through me. Anyone who has an issue with that can take it up with my gun. And when they kill you, Morrison asked, when they burn the town looking for her, then we fight. Carson's eyes swept the room. I need 8 men, men who can shoot, men who won't run when bullets start flying. We set up defensive positions, we protect our own, and we send a message that Red Hollow doesn't hand over its people to killers. The silence stretched. Eleanor counted heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. Then a hand went up. Old Jacob Fletcher, who'd served in the army before most of the people in this room were born. I can still shoot. Another hand. Tom Sullivan, whose farm bordered the town's edge. I'm in. One by one hands rose. Not all of them. Not even most. But 8 hands went up, and 8 men stood, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest that might have been the last of her resolve not to care what happened to this town. Carson nodded. Good. We meet at the livery in 1 hour. Bring your guns and whatever ammunition you have. Mrs. Brooks will train you. Every eye in the church turned to Eleanor again. This time the looks were different. Not judgment, not pity, calculation. They were measuring her, trying to reconcile the quiet seamstress with whatever Carson thought she could teach them about fighting. Eleanor wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the desert and let Red Hollow solve its own problems. But Sterling was here, and these 8 men were willing to die to protect her, even though they didn't know her, didn't owe her, didn't understand what they were signing up for. She owed them the truth, or at least part of it. Eleanor pushed away from the wall and walked down the center aisle. People shifted in their seats, giving her space. When she reached the front, she turned to face them all. My name is Eleanor Brooks, she said. Her voice was quiet but carried in the stillness. 12 years ago, I was Lieutenant Eleanor Brooks of the 7th Cavalry Medical Unit. I served from 1867 to 1881. During that time, I was trained as both a field medic and a marksman. I have 127 confirmed kills at ranges from 100 to 300 yards. The silence was so complete, Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat. Wade Kellerman served under my command. I reported him for war crimes. He was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. Now he wants revenge, not just on me, on everything I tried to protect. If you're willing to stand with me, I'll teach you what I know. But understand this, I'm dying. I have maybe 6 months left. And I stopped being a soldier 12 years ago because I couldn't live with what being a soldier made me. She paused, looking at the 8 men who'd volunteered. If you want to change your minds, now's the time. I won't think less of you. I'd probably do the same. None of them moved. Jacob Fletcher spoke first. Ma'am, I fought in the war, lost friends, lost brothers, but I never met anyone with 127 confirmed kills. That makes you either the best shot I've never heard of or a liar. Either way, I figure you can teach me something. Eleanor almost smiled. The best shots are the ones you never hear about. That's the point. The training began an hour later behind the livery where there was open ground and enough distance that stray bullets wouldn't hit anything important. Eleanor had them line up tin cans on fence posts at 50 yards. Not a difficult shot. Any man who'd grown up in the territory could make it 9 times out of 10. But Eleanor wasn't teaching them to shoot. She was teaching them to shoot when their hands shook with fear, when bullets were flying back, when every instinct screamed to run, and only discipline kept them standing. She had them run 50 yards, then immediately take aim and fire. 3 of them missed. She had them do it again and again, until their lungs burned and their hands trembled from exhaustion and the cans became impossible targets that refused to fall. Then she showed them how it was done. Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted her rifle. The tremor was worse in the afternoon heat, made worse by stress and fear, and the simple reality of a body that had begun its slow rebellion. She breathed in, held it, let half out. The rifle steadied. Not completely. Nothing could make the tremor go away, but it quieted enough. She fired. The can jumped off its post, spinning away into the dust. Reloaded, fired. Another can fell. 6 shots, 6 cans. Her hands shaking the entire time, but the bullets flying true because she'd learned long ago that steadiness wasn't about eliminating the shake. It was about finding the rhythm of it, breathing with it, making it part of the motion instead of fighting against it. When she lowered the rifle, the 8 men were staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle. "How?" Tom Sullivan asked. "Your hands are shaking worse than mine." "Because I've been shaking for 12 years, Eleanor said. "You learned to work with it, or you learned to miss." "I chose not to miss." Old Jacob laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound. "Jesus Christ, you really are her, the angel of death." Eleanor flinched at the name. She'd earned it at Canyon Creek, where she'd held off an enemy assault for 40 minutes while her unit evacuated wounded. 107 shots fired, 73 confirmed kills. Combined with her other engagements over the years, the border skirmishes, the railway defense, the siege at Fort Harrison, the number had grown to 127. 127 lives ended by her hand. The rest were probables, bodies they couldn't verify because they'd been too busy running for their lives. The newspapers had loved it. The angel of death, they'd called her. Like killing was holy work if you did it well enough. Like precision made murder into something noble. "That name belongs to someone who doesn't exist anymore," Eleanor said quietly. "Maybe," Jacob replied, "but right now we could use her." They trained until the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Eleanor taught them about breathing, about patience, about the difference between shooting at a target and shooting at a man who was shooting back. She taught them to use cover to move between positions, to never stay in one place long enough for an enemy to mark their location. She taught them everything the Army had taught her, everything that had kept her alive through 7 years of war. What she didn't teach them was how to live with it afterward. That lesson came later in sleepless nights and trembling hands and the slow understanding that some things once learned could never be unlearned. Sarah Dalton showed up an hour before sunset. Eleanor noticed her standing at the edge of the practice area watching. When the men took a break to reload and rest, Sarah approached. "Marshal Carson said you needed more shooters." Eleanor looked at her. Really looked for maybe the first time. Sarah was thin, worn down by hard work and harder circumstances. But her eyes were clear, and her hands, when she held them out, were steady. "You know how to shoot." "My husband taught me. Said a woman alone in the territory needed to know how to protect herself." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "He was right. Just didn't count on fever being what I had to protect myself from." Eleanor handed her a rifle. "Show me." Sarah took the weapon, checked that it was loaded, aimed at a can 50 yards distant. Her stance was wrong. Her grip was too tight. Her breathing was all over the place. But when she fired, the can jumped and fell. "Again," Eleanor said. Sarah fired 5 more times, hit 4 out of 6. "You have talent," Eleanor said. "Raw talent, but talent gets you killed if you don't have discipline." "Then teach me discipline." Something in Sarah's voice made Eleanor pause. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't false courage. It was the sound of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing left to fear. Eleanor knew that sound, recognized it like looking in a mirror. "All right," she said, "but understand something. Learning to kill isn't like learning to sew or cook. Once you cross that line, you don't get to uncross it. You'll carry it the rest of your life. I'm already carrying the rest of my life, Sarah replied. Might as well make it count for something. They trained until darkness made shooting impossible. Then Eleanor sent them all home with instructions to get whatever sleep they could. Tomorrow, she told them, Wade would make his move. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. She was right, but not in the way she expected. The attack came at dawn when the world was gray and undefined, and people were just beginning to stir. Eleanor was already awake, had been awake for hours, unable to sleep through the anticipation of violence that sat in her chest like a stone. She was making coffee when she heard it. Gunfire, multiple shots, coming from the center of town. Eleanor dropped the coffee pot and ran. Her hands shook so badly she could barely get her boots on. She grabbed the rifle from where it leaned against the wall, her fingers clumsy with the speed of her movements. Outside, the gray dawn was split by orange muzzle flashes and the crack of rifles echoing between buildings. Main Street had become a war zone. Wade and 5 riders were systematically shooting out windows, firing into buildings, not aiming to kill, but to terrify. The baker's shop window exploded in a shower of glass. The church bell took a bullet and rang with an off-key clang that sounded like a scream. People were running, dragging children, seeking cover. A woman Eleanor didn't know was crouched behind a water trough, holding a baby and sobbing. An old man was on the ground near the mercantile, clutching his leg where a bullet had caught him. Not a killing shot, not even a particularly serious wound, but enough to send a message. This is what happens. This is what you get for protecting her. Eleanor's training kicked in without thought. She scanned the street, marked positions, calculated angles. 3 shooters on horseback, 2 more on foot using the livery as cover. Wade himself sitting his horse in the middle of Main Street like a king surveying his domain. They were making it easy, exposing themselves, confident that no one in Red Hollow had the skill or courage to fight back. They were wrong. Eleanor raised her rifle, sighted on the nearest horseman. Her hands shook. She breathed through it, finding the rhythm, waiting for the gap between heartbeats when the tremor stilled just enough. Squeezed the trigger. The shot took the man's hat clean off his head. Didn't touch him. Didn't need to. The message was clear. I could have killed you and chose not to. Every gun in the street swung toward her. Eleanor was already moving, dropping low, rolling behind a rain barrel as bullets chewed into the ground where she'd been standing. She came up on the other side, rifle, already tracking a new target. The second horseman, the one reaching for his own rifle. She fired. This time she aimed for his weapon, not him. The bullet struck metal, and the rifle went spinning out of his hands. The men scattered, seeking cover, suddenly aware that Red Hollow had teeth after all. Eleanor reloaded, her hands working automatically through the tremor. She'd done this 1,000 times. Could do it blind. Could do it while bullets sang past her head and death brushed close enough to feel its breath. She just never wanted to do it again. Marshal Carson appeared from his office, shotgun in hand. The 8 men Eleanor had trained yesterday came running from various directions, guns ready. Sarah Dalton was there too, materializing from between buildings with a rifle that looked too big for her slight frame. Wade saw them coming, saw his easy target turning into a real fight. He smiled, and even from 50 yards away, Eleanor could see it was the smile of a man who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. There she is, Wade shouted. The angel of death herself, still got those steady hands, Brooks. Eleanor didn't answer, was already sighting on the 3rd horseman, who was bringing his rifle to bear on Sarah. Eleanor's shot came first. She aimed for his horse's reins, severing them, sending the animal into a panicked rear that threw its rider and created chaos among Wade's men. The street erupted, gunfire from both sides now. Eleanor lost track of individual shots, individual targets. The world contracted to motion and threat, to identifying danger and eliminating it before it could eliminate her people. Her people. When had she started thinking of them that way? A bullet struck the rain barrel 2 inches from her head. Water started leaking out, soaking the ground. Eleanor shifted position, moving to better cover. As she moved, she saw one of Wade's men draw a bead on Tom Sullivan, who was exposed in the middle of the street trying to reload with hands made clumsy by fear. Eleanor didn't think. Raised her rifle, sighted, fired. The bullet took Wade's man in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, not intentional. She'd been aiming for his gun arm to disable, not to kill. But her hands had shaken at the wrong moment, and the bullet had gone higher than intended. The man screamed and went down. Blood spread across his shirt, bright red against dirty fabric. He wasn't dead. Wouldn't die from that wound if someone got him medical attention. But Eleanor had shot him, had drawn blood, had broken the vow she'd made 12 years ago to never hurt another living soul. The world tilted. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at what she'd done. Then Sarah was beside her, grabbing her arm, pulling her behind better cover. "You saved Tom's life, focus." Eleanor tried to compartmentalize, to push the guilt down deep where it couldn't touch her. But it kept rising up, threatening to choke her. She'd shot a man, had watched him fall, had seen his blood. She was Lieutenant Brooks again, the angel of death, the woman who killed with precision and called it duty. Wade's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" The shooting stopped. Wade's men pulled back, dragging their wounded companion with them. They retreated to the far end of Main Street, still visible but out of easy range. Wade sat his horse, staring down the street toward where Eleanor crouched behind a storefront. "You shot him, Brooks? You shot a man. Guess you're still a killer after all." He was right, and that was exactly what he'd wanted. Not to hurt Red Hollow, not even to hurt Eleanor, but to prove that she was still what she'd always been. That 12 years of hiding hadn't changed her nature. That when pushed, she would kill. And she had. Eleanor's chest constricted. She couldn't get air. Her vision narrowed to a pinpoint. From very far away, she heard Sarah calling her name, felt hands on her shoulders, but none of it mattered, because the only thing that mattered was the truth Wade had just forced her to face. She'd lied to herself. All these years, she'd told herself she'd changed, that she'd left that woman behind. But the first time violence came knocking, she'd answered with violence. Precision violence, exact violence. The kind of violence that came from hundreds of hours of training and practice and becoming very, very good at ending human life. When her vision cleared, she found herself sitting on the ground, back against a wall, Sarah kneeling beside her with worry etched into every line of her face. "He's alive," Sarah was saying. "The man you shot, Dr. Hayes is with him. He'll live." Eleanor shook her head. Whether he lived or died didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd pulled the trigger, had crossed the line she'd sworn never to cross again. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't be her again." Sarah's grip on her shoulders tightened. "You just saved 3 lives, Tom the baker's wife, that child hiding behind the trough. You did that. Not the angel of death. You. You don't understand. Once I start, I can't stop. It's like falling. Once you are in the air, gravity takes over. Then don't start falling. Stay right here. Stay Eleanor Brooks, the seamstress. Let the rest of us fight." But even as Sarah said it, they both knew it was impossible. Wade had pulled Eleanor back into the war, and wars didn't end just because one side wanted them to. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. Marshal Carson posted guards at key positions. The wounded man was moved to Dr. Hayes' office and treated. Frank Morrison organized the civilians, getting them to fortify their homes to gather supplies in case of siege. And Eleanor sat in the church alone, staring at nothing. Sarah found her there as the sun began to set. She sat down beside Eleanor without speaking, just sharing the silence. Finally, Eleanor broke it. "I have a daughter." The words came out flat, emotionless. Sarah turned to look at her, surprise clear on her face. "Her name is Mary. She's 11 years old. Lives in Santa Fe with a family who thinks they adopted an orphan." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "I gave her up when she was 2 days old. Sent her away so she wouldn't grow up around war and death, and a mother who made her living killing people from distances they couldn't even see." "Does she know about you?" "She knows there's a woman named Eleanor Brooks who sends money twice a year and writes letters she never signs. She doesn't know I'm her mother, doesn't know what I am, what I was." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor pulled an envelope from her pocket. Her name was written on the outside in her own careful script. "Because Wade knows about her. One of his men said something while they were retreating, about knowing where my daughter is. If I die, if Wade wins, he'll go after her. Not to hurt her, to prove a point, to show that everything I tried to protect by walking away was meaningless." She held out the envelope. "This is a letter, for Mary, explaining everything. If I don't survive, I need you to take it to her. Take Sterling too. He's all I have to leave her besides the truth. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. You're not going to die. Everyone dies, Sarah. I'm just doing it faster than most. The shaking, the coughing, it's not just nerves, is it? Eleanor shook her head. Dr. Hayes thinks it's some kind of nervous condition. But I know better. 14 years breathing gun smoke and battlefield dust. 14 years breathing death. It catches up eventually. She stood moving to the window. Outside Red Hollow was settling into uneasy night. Lamps were being lit. Families were gathering close. People were trying to pretend that everything was normal, even as they jumped at every sound. Wade sent a message while you were with the wounded, Eleanor said. Wants to meet tomorrow at dawn. The old freight yard south of town. Just him and me. Says if I don't come, he rides to Santa Fe. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap, but he means what he says about Mary. I can't let him hurt her. Can't let her pay the price for my choices. Sarah stood joining Eleanor at the window. Then we all go. Surround the freight yard. Make sure Wade doesn't walk away, even if you don't. No, if I bring others, he'll know. He'll have men watching. The moment anyone besides me shows up, he'll ride for Santa Fe. This has to end between him and me, the way it should have ended in 1874. They stood together watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Sarah spoke. What was she like, the woman you used to be? Eleanor was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she wouldn't answer. Then, she was someone who believed skill could make the world better. That if she was good enough, precise enough, she could save more lives than she took. She was wrong, but she believed it anyway. And that belief let her do terrible things with a clear conscience. Do you miss her? Every day, and not at all. Eleanor turned from the window. I should go. Need to check on Sterling. Make sure he's ready for tomorrow. Ready for what? Eleanor didn't answer. Some questions didn't have answers you could speak aloud. The livery was quiet when Eleanor arrived. Most of the horses were settled for the night, drowsing in their stalls. But Sterling was awake, watching the door as if he'd been waiting for her. Eleanor let herself into his stall and stood beside him, not speaking, just breathing in the familiar smell of horse and hay and something that took her back to nights before battles when morning was uncertain and the only certainty was the animal beneath her. One more ride, she whispered. That's all I'm asking. One more time and then we're done. Then you can rest. You've earned it. God knows you've earned it. Sterling's breath was warm against her palm. In the dimness, his eyes reflected lamplight, making them seem almost luminous, knowing, as if he understood not just her words but the weight beneath them. Eleanor pressed her forehead against his shoulder. I'm so tired, Sterling. Tired of running. Tired of pretending to be someone I'm not. Tired of carrying all of this. Her voice broke. I just want it to be over. Sterling made a low sound in his chest. Not quite a whinny, something softer. Something that might have been comfort if horses could offer such things. Eleanor stayed there until her legs ached from standing and her eyes burned from holding back tears that wouldn't help anything. Then she gave Sterling extra grain, checked his hooves, brushed his coat until it gleamed even in the poor light. She was stalling. Knew it. Couldn't help it. Tomorrow morning, one way or another, everything would end. Either Wade would kill her or she would kill him. Either way, Lieutenant Eleanor Brooks would finally stop haunting the woman who tried to bury her. When she finally left the livery, the streets were empty. Red Hollow had locked itself down for the night, every window dark, every door barred. The only light came from Carson's office, where the marshal kept watch over a town that had suddenly learned it wasn't as safe as it had pretended to be. Eleanor walked home through shadows, her hand resting on the small revolver she'd taken to carrying. Not the rifle. That would come tomorrow. Tonight she just needed something to make the darkness feel less absolute. Her house, when she reached it, felt different. She stood in the doorway trying to identify what had changed. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had been disturbed. But the air felt charged somehow, as if the coming violence had already started seeping through the walls. Eleanor lit a lamp and sat at her small table. The trunk was still in the corner, still locked. But tonight she didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Didn't need to see the uniform or the rifle or the photograph of men who were mostly dead. Those things were just objects. The real burden was inside her. had been inside her since that first shot she'd fired in combat when she discovered she had a talent for killing, and that talent could keep people alive. That was the trap, the terrible bargain. She was good at ending life, which meant she could protect life. And once you accepted that bargain, once you let yourself believe that killing could be righteous, if done with enough skill, there was no going back. Not really. You just got better at lying to yourself about it. Eleanor wrote a second letter that night. This one was to Wade. She kept it short: Dawn, Freight Yard, just us. You win, you let Red Hollow be. I win, you leave and never come back. Either way, it ends tomorrow. She sealed it, left her house, and walked to the saloon where she knew Wade's men would be drinking. She handed the letter to the bartender with instructions to deliver it. Then she walked home through streets that seemed to hold their breath, waiting. In his camp, outside town, Wade Kellerman sat by a small fire reading Eleanor's letter by flickering light. When he finished, he smiled. Not the cruel smile of a man contemplating revenge. Something sadder, more resigned. Finally, he said to no one. Finally, she stops running. His men were asleep. They didn't understand this wasn't about revenge anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. This was about Wade proving something to himself. Proving that the woman who'd destroyed his life was still the same woman who'd once saved it. That her judgment of him had been right or wrong, honorable or hypocritical. That somewhere in the years and the hatred and the hunting, there was still meaning. Wade pulled out his own photograph. The same one Eleanor had, the one showing 12 young men who'd thought they were invincible. He found his own face there, grinning at a camera, both hands whole, his future still ahead of him. He'd worshipped Eleanor back then. Not romantically, not like that, but the way a young man worships someone who embodies everything he wants to become. Skilled, confident, deadly when necessary but controlled, precise. A soldier who killed efficiently but felt every death, who carried the weight without letting it crush her. At least that's what he'd thought. What he'd believed until he'd seen her face when she testified against him at the court-martial. Seen the cold certainty there, the absolute conviction that he was wrong and she was right, and that was all there was to it. That was when he had understood. She didn't carry the weight, she just pretended to. She was a killer who'd found a way to make killing seem noble, and she judged him for being the same thing without the pretense. Or maybe he was wrong. Maybe she did carry it, and that's why she'd run. Why she'd buried herself in a nothing town and pretended to be someone else for 12 years. Tomorrow he'd find out. Tomorrow they'd stand across from each other without the army, without duty, without anything except what they'd both become in the years since they'd been something else. Wade folded the photograph carefully and placed it back in his pocket. Then he loaded his rifle, checked his revolver, and settled down to wait for dawn. Tomorrow, one way or another, it would all be over. And somewhere in the darkness, Eleanor Brooks did the same. Dawn came to the Arizona desert the way it always did, turning the sky from black to gray to gold in gradual stages that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Eleanor had watched it happen from Sterling's stall, where she'd spent the last hours before sunrise sitting in the straw, her back against the wall, listening to the horse breathe. She hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. Sleep was for people with futures, and Eleanor had accepted somewhere in the dark hours that her future had narrowed to a single point, a single moment. Everything before had been prologue. Everything after would be epilogue written by other people. Sterling had stayed awake with her, standing in that patient way horses have, occasionally shifting his weight or blowing softly through his nostrils. Waiting. He'd always been good at waiting. As the first gray light began filtering through the stable walls, Eleanor stood. Her body protested, joints stiff from sitting on cold ground, muscles tight with anticipation. The tremor in her hands was worse this morning. Lack of sleep, stress, fear, all of it compounding into a shake that made even simple movements difficult. She brushed Sterling anyway, long, careful strokes that settled both their nerves. This was ritual, had been ritual for 12 years, since that first morning when a young lieutenant had been assigned a half-wild 6-year-old stallion and told to make something useful out of him. They'd made something all right, something that probably shouldn't have existed, a partnership built on trust and training, and the kind of understanding that develops when you carry each other through hell and come out the other side, still breathing. One more time, Eleanor whispered, running her hand down Sterling's neck. That's all. Then you can rest, I promise. Sterling turned his head, regarding her with that dark, knowing eye. If horses could understand promises, he understood this one. Understood it was both true and a lie. True that after today there would be rest. A lie and pretending rest was what either of them wanted. Eleanor saddled him with hands that shook but didn't fumble. Muscle memory carried her through the motions. Cinched tight but not too tight. Bit positioned correctly. Reins gathered but not pulled. Every movement precise because precision was all she had left. The rifle went into its scabbard. The revolver went into her belt. Extra ammunition went into her pockets, weighing her down with the metal promise of violence. She looked at herself in the small mirror that hung by the stable entrance and saw Lieutenant Brooks looking back. Older, grayer, diminished by time and disease, but still recognizable as the woman who'd once been called the Angel of Death. Eleanor mounted. Sterling stood perfectly still beneath her, taking her weight without complaint, despite his own age and aches. When she was settled, she allowed herself one moment of doubt, one moment to consider running, taking Sterling and riding south, leaving Red Hollow and Wade and all of it behind. Then the moment passed. She'd been running for 12 years. Running didn't solve problems. It just moved them to different locations. Eleanor touched her heels to Sterling's flanks. The old horse moved forward with the smooth gait of long practice, carrying her through Red Hollow's empty streets as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to build. The freight yard sat at the southern edge of town, a graveyard of ambition, where railroad companies had once promised to bring civilization and commerce. All that remained were rusted rails leading nowhere, collapsed loading platforms and freight cars slowly returning to the earth that had spawned the iron ore they'd been made from. Wade was already there. Eleanor saw him from 100 yards out, sitting his horse in the center of the open ground, silhouetted against the rising sun. 5 other riders were positioned around the perimeter, far enough back to give the illusion of a fair fight, but close enough to intervene if things went wrong. For Wade. If things went wrong for Wade. Eleanor rode Sterling forward slowly, scanning the terrain with eyes that still knew how to mark cover and calculate angles of fire. The freight cars provided good positions. The rail embankment offered high ground. The open center was a killing field, where whoever moved first would have every advantage. She stopped 50 feet from Wade, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough that neither could reach the other in a single rush. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. 2 people who'd once fought on the same side, now separated by a gulf that might as well have been an ocean. Time had marked Wade too, made him harder, leaner. The scar on his face had faded to a white line, but his eyes held a weight that hadn't been there 13 years ago. "You came," Wade said finally. "Wasn't sure you would." "I said I would." "You said a lot of things once, didn't make them all true." Eleanor didn't rise to the bait. "You wanted this meeting. Here I am. Say what you came to say." Wade smiled. It looked painful, like his face had forgotten how. "What's to say that hasn't already been said? You destroyed my life. I've spent 12 years hunting you. Now we're here. Seems pretty clear what happens next." "Does it?" Eleanor shifted in the saddle. Sterling remained motionless beneath her. "Because from where I'm sitting, we have choices. You could ride away. I could ride away. Red Hollow survives. Mary stays safe. Everyone gets to wake up tomorrow. Everyone except my honor. Everyone except the truth about what you really are." "And what am I?" Wade leaned forward. "A killer who found a way to make it respectable. Who killed 127 men and got medals for it. Who judged me for doing the same thing but without the permission slip." The words hit harder than Eleanor expected, because they weren't entirely wrong. She had killed, had been good at it, had received commendations and promotions, while men like Wade, who killed messier, but often for the same reasons, were punished and cast out. "I judged you for torturing prisoners," Eleanor said quietly, "not for killing enemy soldiers. There's a difference." "Is there?" "We're all prisoners when you get down to it. Prisoners of war, prisoners of duty, prisoners of what we become when we do what we're told often enough that it stops feeling wrong." Sterling shifted, sensing the tension rising between the humans on his back and the one across from them. Eleanor gentled him with a touch, her hand finding the familiar groove in his mane. "I'm not going to debate philosophy with you, Wade. You wanted me here. I'm here. What now?" Wade reached behind him and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. The movement was slow, deliberate, not threatening yet. He held it across his saddle, one hand on the stock, the other near the trigger. Now you prove to me that you're still who you were. That all this time, pretending to be a seamstress, pretending to be harmless, was just that, pretense. That underneath you're still the angel of death. I'm not her anymore. Prove it. Drop your guns. Right away. Let me kill you without a fight. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively toward her rifle. Stopped. Wade was right. If she was truly done with violence, done with being Lieutenant Brooks, then she should be able to accept death without reaching for weapons. Should be able to let it end here. But her hand wouldn't move away from the rifle. Wouldn't accept the passive ending. Because Lieutenant Brooks wasn't dead. Wasn't buried deep. Was right here, right now, calculating wind speed and distance and the exact angle needed to put a bullet through Wade Kellerman's head before he could finish raising his own weapon. I can't, Eleanor said. The admission hurt worse than any bullet. God help me, I can't. Wade nodded slowly. I know. That's what I came here to prove. That you're still what you always were. That your judgment of me was hypocrisy. That we're the same. He raised his rifle. Eleanor raised hers. For 3 heartbeats, they aimed at each other across 50 feet of Arizona dust, while the sun climbed higher and the heat began to shimmer in waves that made everything uncertain. Then Wade fired first. The bullet took Eleanor in the left shoulder exactly where he'd aimed. Not a killing shot, not even a crippling one, just enough to prove he could hit what he aimed at, enough to draw blood and pain and bring the past crashing into the present. Eleanor gasped, nearly dropping her rifle. Sterling danced sideways but held steady, years of training overriding instinct to bolt. The pain was bright and sharp and pulled Eleanor's vision down to a tunnel. Through that tunnel, she saw Wade working the bolt on his rifle, chambering another round. She should shoot, should put him down before he could fire again. Her finger found the trigger. Her eye found the sight. Wade's chest filled her vision, an easy target at this range, despite the pain and the shaking and the blood starting to soak through her shirt. But she didn't fire. Couldn't fire. Because if she did, Wade would be right. She would still be the angel of death. Would still be Lieutenant Brooks. Would still be the woman who solved problems by being better at killing than anyone else. Eleanor lowered her rifle. Wade stared at her, confusion replacing certainty on his scarred face. What are you doing, not becoming you? I'll kill you, right here, right now. I know. Wade's rifle wavered. His finger was on the trigger. All he had to do was squeeze. End it. Prove his point. Walk away vindicated in his hatred. But he didn't fire. The rifle shook in his hands, not from physical tremor, but from something deeper. Some fundamental inability to cross the line from theory to action, from wanting revenge to taking it. Why? Wade's voice cracked. Why won't you fight? Why won't you prove me right? Because you're not right. We're not the same. I killed in war. You killed after. I followed orders. You followed hate. I stopped. You never started. The rifle fell from Wade's hands, clattering to the ground. He slumped in his saddle, suddenly looking older than his 36 years. Looking like a man who'd spent 12 years building toward a moment, only to discover the moment was empty. You destroyed me, he said. It came out broken. Lost. You destroyed yourself. I just reported what you did. Movement from the perimeter. Wade's men, seeing their leader faltering, started moving in. Eleanor saw them coming, saw the trap closing, saw that this had never been about honor or truth, but about Wade needing witnesses to his righteousness. She should run, should wheel Sterling around and ride hard for Red Hollow and hope the old horse had one more sprint in him. But the shoulder wound was bleeding badly now, making her dizzy. And even if they made it, Wade's men would follow, would burn the town, would hurt people who'd never asked to be part of this. Eleanor raised her rifle one-handed, ignoring the screaming pain from her shoulder. Aimed not at Wade, but at the nearest rider. Haul them off or I start dropping them. Wade looked at his men, looked at Eleanor, saw something in her eyes that made him believe the threat. He raised his hands, signaling them to stop. She's right, he called out. This is between us. Stay back. The riders hesitated, but obeyed. Eleanor kept her rifle up, kept them in her peripheral vision while watching Wade. Blood was running down her arm, now dripping onto Sterling's neck. The horse stood absolutely still, as if understanding that any movement might upset the fragile balance. "What now?" Wade asked. "We can't stay here forever." "Now you choose. Kill me and prove you're everything I said you were, or let me go and prove you're something better." Wade's hand dropped to his revolver. Drew it. The motion was smooth, practiced, inevitable. Eleanor watched it happen without moving, without raising her rifle to defend herself. If this was how it ended, so be it. At least she'd die knowing she'd tried to be better than what war had made her. Wade aimed the revolver at Eleanor's chest. His hand was steady. His eyes were clear. Everything about him said he was going to fire. Then Sterling moved. Not a big movement, just a single step forward, placing himself more completely between Eleanor and the gun. The horse's ears were back, his body tense, every line of him radiating protection. Wade stared at Sterling, at the old war horse who'd carried Eleanor through battles that had killed better men, at the animal who'd survived 18 years of hard living and was still trying to save his rider. "Jesus," Wade whispered, "even the horse is braver than me." He lowered the gun, let it fall from his fingers into the dust beside his rifle. When he looked up at Eleanor again, his eyes were wet. "I can't. I thought I could, but I can't. You win. Nobody wins this." "No, I guess not." Eleanor swayed in the saddle. The blood loss was catching up with her. The world was starting to gray at the edges. She needed to get back to town, get medical attention before she passed out and fell off Sterling and bled to death in the dust. She turned Sterling toward Red Hollow. The horse moved carefully, sensing her weakness. They made it maybe 10 yards before one of Wade's men, seeing the confrontation ending, without bloodshed, without victory, decided to take matters into his own hands. The shot came from Eleanor's blind side. She never saw it coming. Never had time to react. The bullet wasn't aimed at her. It hit Sterling in the left flank, tearing through muscle and causing the old horse to scream and stagger. Eleanor felt him going down, felt gravity taking over, tried to kick free of the stirrups, but couldn't manage it with one arm useless in her coordination shot. They fell together. Sterling managed to twist as he fell, trying even in that moment to protect his rider. But physics didn't care about intention. Eleanor hit the ground hard, her head striking a rock with a sound that echoed across the freight yard. Then everything went dark. When Eleanor woke, the world was white. White ceiling, white walls, white sheets. For a moment she thought she was dead. Thought this was whatever came after, bleached clean of color and complexity. Then pain announced itself. Her shoulder throbbed. Her head felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through it. Her chest burned with every breath. These weren't the sensations of death. These were the sensations of a body trying very hard to keep living, despite excellent reasons not to. "Easy," a hand on her arm. Dr. Hayes's lined face swam into focus above her. "Don't try to move yet. You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days. Eleanor tried to process that, tried to remember what had happened. The freight yard, Wade, the gunshot, Sterling. "Sterling." Her voice came out as a croak. "Where's Sterling?" Dr. Hayes's expression tightened. "The horse is alive. Barely. The bullet went through muscle, missed the vitals. But he's old Eleanor. That kind of trauma at his age. I need to see him. You need to stay in bed. You have a severe concussion, a shoulder wound that's infected, and your lungs are in worse shape than I thought. You're dying, Eleanor, actively dying. I give you maybe 2 months." 2 months, less than she'd thought, less than she'd hoped, but enough time to see Sterling again. Enough time to do what needed doing. "Help me up. Eleanor, you can barely breathe." "Then I'll die breathing, but I'm seeing my horse." Dr. Hayes knew better than to argue with a woman who'd survived 12 years of war and 12 more years of slowly dying. He helped her sit up, helped her swing her legs over the side of the bed, helped her stand on legs that shook worse than her hands ever had. The walk to the livery took 20 minutes. It should have taken 5. Eleanor had to stop every few yards to catch her breath, to let the dizziness pass, to convince her body to keep moving, despite every signal screaming that it was done. Sarah Dalton met her at the livery entrance. The younger woman's eyes were red from crying. "He won't eat, won't drink, just stands there staring at the door like he's waiting for you." Eleanor pushed past her into the dim interior. Sterling was in his usual stall, standing in exactly the position Sarah had described. When he saw Eleanor, his ears pricked forward. He made that low rumbling sound in his chest that was his version of calling her name. Eleanor went to him, moving faster than was wise, ignoring the pain and the vertigo. When she reached his stall, she saw the bandages wrapped around his flank, saw how much weight he'd lost in 3 days, saw the slight tremor in his legs that meant he was in pain and exhausted, but refusing to lie down. "Oh, Sterling," Eleanor's voice broke. "You stubborn, loyal, beautiful fool." She let herself into the stall. Sterling's nose found her hand nuzzling gently, looking for sugar cubes she didn't have, looking for reassurance she couldn't give, looking for some sign that things would be all right, even though they both knew better. Eleanor wrapped her good arm around his neck, pressed her face against his warm coat, and cried. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief, ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her whole body and made breathing even harder, but felt necessary in a way nothing had felt necessary in years. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry. You should have left me years ago. Should have found someone who didn't drag you into wars and feuds and violence. You deserved better than me." Sterling just stood there, solid and warm and patient, waiting the way he'd always waited, for orders, for direction, for Eleanor to tell him what came next. But Eleanor didn't know what came next. For the first time in 18 years, she had no plan, no strategy, no clear objective. Just 2 months left, and a horse who'd given her everything, and a daughter who didn't know her, and a town that had seen her true face and couldn't unsee it. Sarah's hand on her shoulder brought her back. "You need to rest. Both of you need to rest. I need to see Wade. He's in jail. Marshal Carson arrested him and his men after the shooting. They'll hang for attempted murder." "No." Eleanor straightened, wiping her eyes with her good hand. "I need to see him. Need to finish this." "Eleanor, you can barely stand." "Then I'll sit in the cell with him. But I need to see him, please." Sarah studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll get the marshal." The jail was a small stone building attached to Carson's office. 2 cells rarely occupied because Red Hollow wasn't the kind of place that bred serious criminals. Today, 1 cell held 4 of Wade's men. The other held Wade alone, sitting on a narrow cot, staring at nothing. He looked up when Eleanor was helped in by Sarah and Carson. Looked at the bandages, the pallor, the way she could barely hold herself upright. Understanding crossed his face. "You're dying." "We're all dying. I'm just doing it faster." Carson pulled up a chair. Eleanor sank into it gratefully, her legs having used up whatever reserves they'd had. Wade came to the bars, gripping them with his 3-fingered hand. "I didn't tell them to shoot the horse," he said quietly. "That was Johnson. He's always been trigger-happy." "I know. He's the one who deserves hanging. Not me, not the others, just him." "Nobody's hanging." Eleanor looked at Carson. "I'm dropping all charges, against all of them." "Eleanor, they tried to kill you." "No, they tried to make me into something I'm not. There's a difference, Vipario." She turned back to Wade. "You wanted to know if I was still the angel of death. Now you know, I'm not. I'm just a dying woman who wants to spend her last 2 months in peace. Can you give me that?" Wade was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I wasted 12 years hating you. 12 years, I could have been anything else, been anyone else. And for what, to prove you were right about me. I wasn't entirely right. I was rigid, unforgiving. I judged you for breaking under pressure that would have broken most people. That did break most people." Eleanor paused, gathering strength. "I'm sorry for not seeing that, for not giving you a chance to be better. You're apologizing to me after everything. We're both products of a war that ended years ago but keeps killing anyway. Maybe it's time we both stopped letting it." Wade's hands dropped from the bars. He slumped back onto his cot, looking like all the anger and purpose that had driven him for 12 years had suddenly drained away, leaving nothing but exhaustion. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you go home, wherever that is. You start over. You become someone who isn't defined by what happened in 1874. And if you can't do that, if the hate is too deep, then at least go far from here and let me die in peace." Wade nodded slowly. "I can do that, I think, maybe." Eleanor stood with Sarah's help. At the door, she turned back. Wade, for what it's worth, you were a good soldier once before the war broke you. I remember that man. I hope you can find him again. She left before he could respond. Left him sitting in a cell that Carson would release him from in the morning. Left him with choices that were his alone to make. Outside, the sun was setting and painting Red Hollow in shades of gold and shadow. Beautiful if you didn't look too close. If you ignored the scars and the secrets and the way violence always found a way to seep in, no matter how far you ran. The next morning, a rider came from Santa Fe. He carried a telegram that had been forwarded from the Johnson family. Eleanor's hands shook so badly that Sarah had to read it for her. Mary is coming, arrives in 5 days. Johnson family says she insisted. Wants to meet the woman who sends her money. Eleanor's chest constricted. Not enough time to prepare. Not enough time to figure out what to say, how to explain, whether to even tell the truth. But it was all the time she had, so it would have to be enough. She spent those 5 days trying to regain strength that wasn't coming back. Dr. Hayes gave her medicines that dulled the pain but made her foggy. She refused them. Needed to be clear-headed when Mary arrived. Needed to be present for whatever time they had. Sterling improved slightly, started eating again, drinking again. The wound was healing, though he'd always carry a limp now. Eleanor visited him every day, spending hours just sitting in his stall, talking to him about things that didn't matter and things that mattered more than anything. On the 4th day, she had Sarah bring writing materials. Eleanor wrote with her shaking right hand, producing script that looked like it had been written during an earthquake. But the words were clear enough. My dearest Mary, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Know that everything I did, the hiding, the lies, the distance, was to keep you safe. You are my redemption. You are why I stopped killing. Live well, love freely, and forgive your mother for being a coward. Forever yours, Eleanor Brooks. She sealed it, gave it to Sarah with instructions to deliver it only if Eleanor couldn't. Hoped she'd have the courage to give it to Mary herself, but planned for the possibility that courage would fail when it was needed most. Mary arrived on the 5th day, traveling in a wagon with the Johnson family. She was 11 years old, slight and dark-haired, with eyes that held too much awareness for someone so young. Orphans learned to read people early, learned to sense when adults were lying, when situations were dangerous, when the world was about to shift beneath their feet. Eleanor watched from the boarding house window as Mary climbed down from the wagon. Her heart, which had been slowly giving up for 2 months, suddenly decided it wasn't quite ready to quit. This was her daughter, her child, the only good thing she'd ever created. Sarah brought Mary to the room Eleanor had been moved to when it became clear she wouldn't be going home again. The girl entered hesitantly, taking in the sparse furnishings, the medical supplies, the woman who looked far too ill to be the mysterious benefactor she'd imagined. Miss Brooks, Mary's voice was soft but steady. Mary, Eleanor's voice cracked. Thank you for coming. Mrs. Johnson said you were sick, that you might not have much time. Mary moved closer, studying Eleanor's face with unchildlike intensity. Are you dying? Eleanor almost lied. Almost gave some platitude about being fine, just a little under the weather. But something in Mary's eyes stopped her. This child had lost her parents, been given up, survived in a world that didn't care much about orphans. She deserved truth. Yes, I have maybe a month left, maybe less. Mary nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Is that why you sent for me, to say goodbye? Partially, but also because I owe you the truth about who I am, about who you are. Eleanor spent the next hour telling Mary everything. Not the sanitized version. Not the story that would make her seem noble or justified. The real story. The war, the killing, the court-martial, the years of hiding, and finally the truth that mattered most. I'm your mother. I gave you up when you were 2 days old because I thought you'd be safer, better, happier without me. I was wrong, or maybe I was right. I don't know anymore, but you deserve to know where you came from. Mary was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was very small. Why didn't you keep me? Because I was a killer. Because I had blood on my hands that wouldn't wash off. Because I loved you enough to want better for you than a mother who woke screaming in the night and couldn't hold you without remembering all the deaths she'd caused. Do you still love me? The question broke something in Eleanor that had been holding together through sheer will. Every day, every single day for 11 years, I've loved you from a distance and hated myself for the distance and wanted more than anything to be someone worthy of being your mother. Mary climbed onto the bed, careful not to jostle Eleanor's injuries. She curled up beside her, small and warm and alive. I don't care about worthy. I just wanted a mother. Eleanor wrapped her good arm around Mary, pulled her close, and let herself cry for the second time in a week. Not tears of grief this time, something more complicated. Relief and regret and love and loss all tangled together into something that had no name but felt like coming home after a very long journey. They stayed like that until the sun set and the room grew dark and Sarah came to light lamps and gently suggest that Mary needed rest. But before Mary left, Eleanor gave her the letter she'd written. Don't read this now. Read it when you're older, when you can understand better, when you need to know that someone loved you enough to make the hardest choice. Mary took the letter, held it carefully. Will I see you tomorrow? If I'm still here, yes. Then I'll see you tomorrow. Eleanor managed to hang on for another week. 7 days of knowing Mary, of answering her questions, of telling her stories that didn't involve violence. 7 days of being just a mother and daughter, not a soldier, and her secret child. On the 8th day, Eleanor asked Sarah to take Mary to meet Sterling. The old horse was in his stall, stronger now, but still marked by the bullet wound that would never fully heal. When Mary approached, Sterling regarded her with gentle curiosity. This is Sterling, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper now. The lung disease had progressed rapidly. He's the bravest thing I've ever known. When I'm gone, he's yours. Will you take care of him? Mary nodded solemnly. I promise. He likes sugar cubes. And he understands German, though I'd rather you didn't use those words. They're commands from a war that's over. Let him just be a horse now. Let him rest. Eleanor showed Mary how to brush Sterling's coat, how to check his hooves, how to give him treats. The girl took to it naturally, her small hands gentle and sure. Sterling accepted her attention with patient grace, seeming to understand that this was important somehow. That afternoon, Eleanor asked to be taken to see Wade one more time. He'd been released from jail but hadn't left town yet, was staying at the saloon working odd jobs to earn travel money. When Eleanor was carried in on a chair by Sarah and Tom Sullivan, Wade stood up from the table where he'd been eating lunch. He looked different, cleaner, sober, like he'd spent the past week thinking hard about who he wanted to be. Eleanor, he pulled out a chair for her. Hey, dinner. You shouldn't be up. I won't be up much longer. Wanted to see you before the end. They sat together while Sarah and Tom waited by the door. Wade ordered coffee, neither of them touched. Finally, Eleanor spoke. I'm giving Mary to the Johnsons permanently. They're good people. They'll raise her right, but I'm also giving her Sterling. And I'm giving her the truth about me. She paused. I'd like to give her the truth about you, too. The good truth. The man you were before the war. Would you talk to her? Let her know that even broken people can choose to be better. Wade's scarred face worked through several emotions. Why would you want that? Why would you want her to know me at all? Because she needs to understand that people are complicated. That good people do bad things and bad people can choose good. That judgment is easy, but mercy is harder and more important. You can teach her that if you're willing. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll talk to her. I don't know what I'll say, but I'll talk to her. Thank you. Eleanor, I'm going to make something of myself. Don't know what yet, but something better than this. Better than who I've been. I owe you that much. You don't owe me anything, but I'm glad to hear it. That was the last time Eleanor saw Wade Kellerman. He left Red Hollow 3 days later, heading east toward a future that was his to shape. Eleanor heard later that he'd become a blacksmith in a small town in New Mexico, that he'd married, that he'd lived quietly and well and hurt no one. She hoped it was true. On the 13th day after Mary arrived, Eleanor asked Sarah to set up a bed in Sterling's stall. Dr. Hayes protested, said she needed to be where he could monitor her, where treatment was possible. Eleanor overruled him. She was dying. Treatment was a polite fiction at this point. If she was going to die, she wanted to do it next to the one creature who'd never asked her to be anything except what she was. Mary visited every day, would sit beside Eleanor in the straw, holding her hand, talking about things that 11-year-olds talk about when they're trying not to think about death. Books she'd read, friends she had in Santa Fe, dreams about the future. Sometimes Eleanor could respond. Sometimes she could only listen, drifting in and out of consciousness, anchored to the world by Mary's voice and Sterling's steady presence. On the morning of the 16th day, Eleanor woke to find Mary sleeping beside her, one small hand clutched in Eleanor's. Sterling stood over them both, patient and protective. The early light was slanting through the stable walls, painting everything in shades of gold. Eleanor knew with the certainty that comes at the end that this was her last sunrise. She gently extracted her hand from Mary's, not wanting to wake her, not wanting the girl's last memory to be of watching her mother die. She reached up, found Sterling's neck, pulled herself to sitting with strength that shouldn't have been there, but was because the body sometimes grants one final gift to those who need it. Sterling lowered his head, bringing his face close to hers. His breath was warm. His eyes were kind. In them, Eleanor saw every battle they'd fought, every mile they'd traveled, every moment they'd survived together. "Thank you," she whispered, "for carrying me, for never giving up on me, for being the best friend I ever had." Sterling made that low, rumbling sound. If horses could understand gratitude, he understood hers. Eleanor's hand found his mane tangled in it, the way it had tangled 1,000 times before. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let herself drift. When Mary woke an hour later, she found her mother still sitting upright, hand in Sterling's mane, a peaceful expression on her face that the girl had never seen in life. Eleanor Brooks had died the way she'd wanted to, quietly, without drama, next to the one thing that had never judged her for what she'd been or what she'd become. Sterling stood absolutely still, didn't move when Mary started crying, didn't move when Sarah came running, didn't move when Dr. Hayes gently confirmed what everyone already knew. The horse stood guard over Eleanor's body for 12 hours, wouldn't let anyone approach to remove her, wouldn't eat or drink, just stood there patient and immovable, and as if believing that if he held the position long enough, she might wake up and tell him what to do next. Finally, Mary approached. The 11-year-old girl who'd known her mother for only 16 days, but had loved her for all the 11 years of her life. She put her hand on Sterling's nose, looked into his dark eyes, and whispered, "It's okay. You can let her go now. I'll take care of you. I promise." Sterling held for one more moment. Then slowly he stepped back. Let the humans come. Let them take Eleanor's body and prepare it for burial. Let the world keep turning, even though the person who'd given his life meaning was gone. The funeral was held 2 days later. The entire town came. Even people who'd never spoken to Eleanor, who'd never known her story until the end. They came to pay respects to a woman who'd fought for them, died protecting them, given them a final lesson in what it meant to choose mercy over revenge. Wade sent a telegram from New Mexico. Short, simple. "She saved me twice. Once in battle, once in jail. I won't forget." Mary stood beside Sterling throughout the service. The horse had been brushed until his coat gleamed, his mane, braided with care Eleanor would have appreciated. He stood still while Reverend Thomas talked about redemption and sacrifice and the complicated nature of heroism. When they lowered Eleanor into the ground on the hill overlooking Red Hollow, Sterling stepped forward, nudged the coffin once with his nose, a goodbye that didn't need words. Then he turned and walked back down the hill, Mary at his side, beginning a partnership that would last 7 more years. Mary grew up in Red Hollow, raised by the Johnsons, but visiting Sterling every day. She learned to ride him, to care for him, to listen. When he nickered in that way, that meant he was remembering. She read her mother's letter when she turned 18, cried over it, then carefully preserved it for her own children to read someday. Sterling lived quietly in his old age. Sarah Dalton, who'd promised to help care for him, made sure he wanted for nothing. But mostly it was Mary who tended him, who brought him sugar cubes and brushed his coat and whispered stories about a mother she'd barely known but loved completely. Every morning, Sterling walked himself to the hill where Eleanor was buried, would stand there for hours, patient as stone, before returning to the livery. Mary never stopped him, understood that grief in animals looks different than in humans, but is no less real. On a cold morning in December 1893, 7 years after Eleanor's death, Mary arrived at the livery to find Sterling's stall empty. Her heart sank even before she started running toward the hill. Sterling lay beside Eleanor's grave, his head resting against the headstone, as if he'd simply decided to lie down and rest for a moment. His eyes were closed. His breathing had stopped sometime in the night. He died the way Eleanor had died, peacefully, without struggle, in the place that mattered most. Mary knelt beside him, put her hand on his neck, and felt the absence of warmth that meant he was truly gone. She cried for the horse who'd been her connection to a mother she'd barely known. Cried for the faithfulness that had kept him returning to this hill every day for 7 years. Cried for the end of something that had survived war and time and everything the world had thrown at it. They buried Sterling beside Eleanor. Sarah and Marshall Carson and Tom Sullivan dug the grave themselves, refusing to let anyone else do it. They lowered the old war horse into the earth, gently treating him with the respect accorded to soldiers who'd served beyond any reasonable expectation. Mary commissioned a headstone, simple, like Eleanor's, just facts. Sterling, 1868 to 1893, the horse who knew loyalty better than men. Beside it, Eleanor's stone read, Eleanor Brooks, 1840 to 1886, the angel who chose love over war. Two graves, side by side. A woman and a horse who'd survived hell together and found peace in the same quiet corner of Arizona desert. 23 years later, in 1916, an old man named Benjamin Warren sat beside those graves with a notebook in his lap. He'd been writing for 3 days now, trying to capture the story he'd heard from a dozen different sources, trying to make sense of a tale that seemed too strange to be true, but too detailed to be fiction. Benjamin had been a journalist once, had covered wars and scandals and all the dramatic moments that newspapers loved, but he'd never written a story like this one, never tried to put into words the kind of loyalty that transcended species and time and death itself. He read through his final draft, making small corrections. When he was satisfied, he closed the notebook and stood his old bones protesting. The sun was setting, painting the graves in golden light. "I hope I got it right," he said to the stones. "Hope I did justice to what you both were, what you meant to each other." The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass. For a moment, Benjamin could have sworn he heard the distant sound of a horse whinnying. But when he turned, there was nothing there, just empty desert and approaching night. He walked back down the hill toward Red Hollow, leaving two graves on the hilltop where they'd stood for decades and would stand for decades more. Monuments to a partnership that had been forged in war, tested by time and proven stronger than death. Behind him, the sun sank below the horizon. The desert cooled. Stars began appearing in a sky so clear and vast it seemed to hold everything that had ever been and ever would be. And on the hill, two names carved in stone caught the last light of day, holding it for just a moment before releasing it to the coming dark. Eleanor Brooks and Sterling. A woman and a horse. A soldier and her mount. A friendship that had endured everything the world could throw at it and emerged, if not victorious, then at least unbroken. Some bonds, Benjamin thought as he reached the edge of town, weren't made to be understood. They were made to be witnessed, to be remembered, to remind those who came after that loyalty and love and choosing mercy over vengeance weren't just nice ideas. They were ways of being that could change the world. One person at a time, one choice at a time. One act of grace in a world that often had little grace to spare. The story was done. The telling was finished. But the meaning, Benjamin knew, would echo long after everyone who'd known Eleanor and Sterling was dust. That was what stories did, what they were for. They carried truth forward through time, keeping alive the things that mattered most, even when everything else faded away. Benjamin Warren smiled, tucked his notebook under his arm, and walked home through streets that had forgotten most of what had happened here, but would remember two graves on a hill for as long as Red Hollow existed. Some things, it turned out, were too important to forget.